Imagine boarding a short flight that would take less time than, a modern television sitcom would to watch. Think about 20 minutes or so. You're not crossing an ocean, you're not crossing a continent, you're just taking a brief hop over the water. Or, in my case, back when I was a flight attendant, flying from Los Angeles down to Carlsbad or down to San Diego. It's a short flight. But now imagine that somewhere among these passengers sit four men carrying hidden weapons and a plan so unusual that the world does not yet have a proper word for it. What follows will leave 26 people dead and change aviation history forever and expose a legal loophole so astonishing that the only surviving criminal will eventually just walk away a free man. This is not a story about a famous war or a famous battle, but it's a story about a crime that arrived well before the world was really prepared to even understand it. Join me today as I tell the story of the first commercial aircraft hijacking, the doomed flight of the Miss Macao, and the mystery that began after the wreckage sank beneath the water. When people think about hijackings today, they tend to picture a familiar set of images: modern airports and airport security checkpoints, metal detectors, armed police officers, reinforced cockpit doors, emergency procedures, flight attendants that'll take you down if you try it. We take these things for granted because they've existed for many of our lives, for our entire lifespan. It's what we've grown accustomed to. It's what we know. But yet there was a time when none of those protections existed. There was a time well before 9/11 changed things. There was a time when commercial aviation was still young enough that criminals and governments and airlines and passengers were all learning the rules together. In the late 1940s, air travel carried a sense of excitement that's so difficult to recreate today. Flying remained glamorous. Airports were smaller. Security, of course, was minimal. The world was still rebuilding after the devastation of the Second World War. People were optimistic about their futures. Everything looked like it was going to be okay. Aircrafts represented speed and opportunity and modernity. Few people thought of them as targets for organized crime. But to understand our story, we need to travel to the bustling waters between Hong Kong and Macau in 1948. At that time, Macau did not yet possess the kind of airport that most people imagine it would. Instead, flying boats connected to territories to neighboring destinations. When people talk about little bitty planes being puddle jumpers, those are not puddle jumpers. What these people had to fly on was a puddle jumper. A puddle jumper is literally a plane that lands on water, a puddle of water. So these little remarkable aircrafts could land and take off on land, but also on water. And it made them perfectly suited to a region that was defined by these coastlines and harbors and shipping routes that you would see in places like Macau and Hong Kong of the late 1940s. One such aircraft was the consolidated Catalina flying boat known as the Miss Macao. It belonged to Cathay Pacific and was operated by the Macau Air Transport Company. Today, the name sounds quite elegant, sure, almost romantic, but yet history has a habit of attaching dark memories to otherwise innocent names, and that is the case with this particular story. The route itself was short, very short. A flight from Macau to Hong Kong lasted roughly 20 minutes, about the same distance as LA to Carlsbad, which is not quite the same distance as Los Angeles down to San Diego. That fact becomes important because it helps us to understand the confidence of the criminals that were involved. 20 minutes is barely enough time to settle into your seat and glance out of the window and begin thinking about your destination. It was not enough time for me to do a beverage service on board the plane unless there were only about 8 people there. It's not the sort of journey where passengers expect some kind of danger to show up. The brevity of the route created an illusion of, safety. After all, what could possibly happen in such a short span of time? Well, let me tell you, a lot. I know this from personal experience, and I didn't have anything like we're talking about today happen to me. The answer, as events would prove, would be even more than I would have imagined. Macao occupied a unique place in the Far East during those years. Various restrictions on gold trading elsewhere had transformed this territory into kind of an important center for commerce involving precious metals. Wealthy businessmen regularly traveled between Macau and Hong Kong, and they were carrying large amounts of money like gold bullion and valuable financial documents and all this stuff with them as they were traveling. This reality was well known within, shall we say, certain circles. It was known by merchants and by brokers, and unfortunately, it was also known by the spreading of the word by criminals. The passengers boarding Miss Macao on July 16th of 1948 included people of considerable wealth and influence. Some were traders, some were business executives. Others represented successful enterprises spread throughout the region. To 4 particular passengers, these individuals represented a whole lot of new opportunity. Those 4 men had devised a plan that was both ambitious and reckless. They intended to seize control of the aircraft, force it to a location under their control, rob all of the passengers on board, and demand a ransom for their lives. It was a criminal scheme that borrowed elements from kidnapping, piracy, armed robbery, and extortion. The plotters believed that they had identified a weakness in the system. They were correct. There was almost no meaningful airport security at all. There were no metal detectors then, no sophisticated passenger screenings, no X-ray machines, no modern procedures of any kind. If a person carried a concealed weapon and behaved normally, there was a pretty good chance that they were going to board without any kind of difficulty. One member of the gang reportedly concealed multiple revolvers against his body and hid ammunition in the hollowed heels of his shoes. It sounds unbelievable today, but I would like to urge you to look up some of the most recent hijacking attempts and learn what people have gotten up to just in recent years. But in 1948, this was not only possible, but it was maybe even easy. One detail makes the plan even more remarkable, though. The conspirators did not simply intend to seize the aircraft. One of them reportedly possessed enough flying knowledge to help redirect the plane after taking control. Their destination was not just random. They had planned to force the Miss Macao toward a location where they could safely rob their victims and negotiate the ransom payments after they had landed the plane themselves. Everything depended on the surprise, though. Everything depended on the speed and the assumption that the passengers and crew would surrender to them. Because of course they would, wouldn't they? It's 1948. Criminals' plans often rely upon a certain view of human nature. They assume people are going to panic, and they assume that people will obey, and that fear will overwhelm any sense of resistance. And sometimes those assumptions prove, sadly, to be accurate, but sometimes they are catastrophically wrong. And I could not be more proud of these people. The morning of July 16th appeared ordinary. The weather was favorable. The aircraft departed carrying 23 passengers and 4 crew members. Somewhere among those passengers sat these 4 conspirators. Among them were businessmen and travelers and professionals and ordinary individuals expecting nothing more than, arriving in Hong Kong. There was no reason for any kind of alarm, no obvious warning signs, no sign that history was quietly taking its seat aboard the aircraft right alongside them. As the flying boat lifted away from Macau and headed across the water, the journey began like countless others would. Engines would drone on steadily, probably lulling some of them off to sleep, even though it was only a 20-minute flight. I've had it happen. Passengers settled into conversations or to their own private thoughts. They didn't have phones to keep them busy. And the coastline slipped away behind them. Ahead lay glorious, beautiful 1948 Hong Kong, and the promise of an uneventful arrival. Then, only minutes after takeoff, the plan moved into action. Two of the hijackers entered the cockpit carrying a pistol. It was basically, a slight door, maybe even a curtain in between them. And one demanded that the pilots surrender control of the aircraft over to the hijackers. The demand was delivered in clear English. The captain, an American named Dale Kramer, absolutely, staunchly refused. That single refusal altered everything to do with their plan. What happened next unfolded with astonishing speed. In the passenger cabin, another traveler confronted one of these attackers. Accounts indicate that he grabbed hold of a weapon and fought back physically. The neat sequence that these hijackers had imagined began to immediately just unravel right in front of their eyes. Instead of frightened compliance, they encountered strong resistance. It was the end of World War II. These people were not going to take this sitting down anymore. Instead of surrender, they found defiance, and instead of passive victims, they found people willing to fight for their lives. And they did. The struggle spread throughout the aircraft very quickly from the front to the back. The hijackers rushed between the cockpit and the cabin, attempting to regain control of the situation. The crew members joined in the fight. There were fists flying in that cabin. Passengers joined in the fight. Confusion replaced any kind of planning. And the difference between success and failure narrowed within seconds. Every person aboard understood that events had crossed a line from which there was no easy return. And somewhere inside that violent struggle, the fate of the Miss Macao was about to be decided. The co-pilot, Ken McDuff, was not prepared to surrender. During the chaos, he reportedly seized a mooring pole and struck one of the attackers with it. For a brief moment, the outcome hung in the balance. It's easy looking back from the safety of history, from the safety of the future, to imagine the events unfolding quite neatly and cleanly. But they really don't. Real violence is confusing and noisy and unpredictable, and you cannot ever look back from the future and say, I would have, they should have. That's not the way it works. People move at once. Decisions are made in fractions of a second. Nobody aboard the Miss Macao could have known exactly what was happening elsewhere in the aircraft. The captain was fighting for control of the plane. Passengers were struggling with armed men in the back. The hijackers were attempting to recover the plan that was rapidly collapsing around them. And somewhere in all of that confusion, gunfire erupted. Bullets tore through the cabin. The struggle that had begun as an attempted robbery became something much darker all at once. One of the hijackers fired toward the cockpit, and the shots struck both of the pilots. Suddenly, the most important people on board this entire aircraft were gravely wounded. The men responsible for keeping 27 souls alive were no longer fully capable of controlling the flying boat. Modern aircraft are designed with multiple layers of redundancy and technology, and this is part of why the Miss Macao belonged to a different era. It relied heavily on human skill and human judgment, and not hijackers. When the pilots were incapacitated, the margin for survival disappeared pretty much instantly. Witnesses on the ground would later describe seeing the aircraft behave really strangely overhead. But then came the terrifying sight of the flying boat dropping toward the water. Not just flying toward it, but absolutely dropping out of the sky. For the passengers, these final moments must have felt completely unreal. Only minutes earlier, they had been engaged in an ordinary journey, maybe reading a book or looking out of a window or dozing or lost in personal thoughts. But now the aircraft was plunging toward the Pearl River Delta. There was no opportunity for any kind of organized evacuation, no chance to repair, no time to understand, no moment to be able to say goodbyes. The Catalina struck the water with a tremendous amount of force. The impact shattered the aircraft and hurled wreckage across its surface. And nothing but silence followed. Then there was floating debris, and then oil, and then the terrible realization that an entire aircraft had vanished from the sky in less time than it takes for many people to drink a cup of coffee. Not far away, a fisherman had witnessed this entire disaster. He immediately headed toward the crash site. As he approached the wreckage, he discovered something quite astonishing. Amid the debris and destruction, there was one survivor, but just one. The man was pulled from the water and brought to safety, and at first glance, it seemed like a miracle this man was alive at all. Aviation accidents occasionally produce lone survivors, and perhaps this was simply another example of that happening. But yet investigators quickly noticed details that refused to fit comfortably together like the puzzle pieces that they should have. The survivor's explanations were vague. He didn't want to divulge what had happened. Something seemed off. It was fishy. His accounts shifted. Certain facts made little sense. But most curious of all, witnesses had reported hearing sounds resembling gunfire up in the sky before this crash. And questions began accumulating faster than the answers did. The police soon recovered portions of the wreckage and examined them carefully, and what they found transformed the investigation. There were, of course, bullet holes marking the aircraft's interior. Cartridge cases were discovered. Evidence indicated that more than one firearm had been used. Autopsies raised additional questions. Investigators identified wealthy passengers among the dead, but also found several unidentified Chinese men whose backgrounds were unclear. The pieces began fitting together in a disturbing pattern at that rate. This sole survivor, a man by the name of Huang Yu, and is often misattributed to Wang Yu, was initially claimed he said he was ignorant regarding what had happened on board. He had no idea. Oh, I don't know. But the story he offered, of course, was not quite believable. Investigators sensed that he knew far more than he was letting on. So the challenge for them was proving it. The breakthrough came through patience and deception rather than through force. Authorities devised a rather clever strategy. While Huang recovered in the hospital, they arranged circumstances intended to make him believe the truth was already known. A visitor appeared. A conversation unfolded. Huang became convinced that other participants had survived and implicated him. In attempting to defend himself, he revealed details that only a participant of the hijacking could ever possibly know. And the confession emerged. It basically exploded the entire plot. The world now understood what had happened aboard the Miss Macao and to all of his victims. 4 men had boarded, intending to seize the aircraft, rob the wealthy passengers, and demand the ransom. The plan had collapsed into violence, and 26 people had died. The first commercial aircraft hijacking in history was solved that quickly. Or so it seemed. Most crime stories moved toward a courtroom at this point, and this one moved toward a legal abyss, kind of a limbo. The evidence appeared pretty much overwhelming. There was a confession, physical evidence, motive, circumstances, but yet officials soon encountered a problem that no one had anticipated. Whose crime was it? The aircraft was connected to Hong Kong, but the flight had departed Macau. The crash occurred in the waters involving broader jurisdictional questions. Different governments examined this entire situation and arrived at different conclusions, every single one of them. They didn't want to have to deal with it. One authority suggested another should prosecute the other. Another authority pointed somewhere else. Responsibility passed from desk to desk like an unwanted package, and they just continued to pass the buck. Meanwhile, the surviving hijacker, Huang, remained very much alive. And years passed. Imagine being a family member of one of the victims and watching this whole thing unfold. You know that these agencies are just out here passing the buck because they don't want to have to deal with it. The facts were there. The survivor had confessed, but yet the machinery of justice seemed unable to decide who should even turn the key. It was a problem almost nobody had considered before, because nobody had imagined that such a crime would ever occur. The law had been written for a world where crimes happening on land and sea didn't happen in the air. Aviation was advancing faster than the legislation, faster than the laws. Miss Macao had revealed a large gap that was enough for a confessed participant in a mass killing to just slip right through. And that's exactly what happened. In 1951, after years of legal uncertainty, Huang Yu was released without standing trial for his crime. The sole surviving participant in the first commercial aircraft hijacking simply walked out of prison. It remains one of the most astonishing outcomes in aviation history, of course. 26 people were dead. The plot had been reconstructed. They knew what happened. The confession was there. Yet no government successfully ever prosecuted this man. The story that had begun with violence in the sky concluded with a legal vacuum on the ground. For many observers, it felt impossible, yet history is full of moments when reality appears less reasonable than fiction. There was, however, one final twist waiting in the shadows. After his release and deportation, Huang Yu reportedly met an unexpected end. Accounts indicate he later encountered a typhoon and was killed by flying debris. It's the kind of detail that a novelist might hesitate to include for fear that readers might find it a little bit too convenient. But history doesn't worry about literary criticism. History happens as it happens. Whether one views it as irony, coincidence, or something else entirely, the final chapters of his life closed in a manner almost as strange as the crime that made him famous. The legacy of the Miss Macao extends far beyond the fate of a single criminal, too. The disaster exposed this weakness in international aviation law, and that could no longer be ignored. Governments eventually recognized that aircraft did cross borders too easily for jurisdictional confusion to remain an acceptable thing. Decades later, international agreements such as the Hague Convention helped to close these loopholes that were revealed by Huang. Future hijackers would find it far more difficult to exploit uncertainty over prosecution. In a very real sense, modern aviation security owes part of its existence to the lessons learned from a doomed 20-minute flight over the waters of the southern China Sea, and to this one man who got away with all of it, and to the 26 dead left in his wake. Today, when we pass through airport security and remove items from our pockets and place luggage on the scanners and walk through carefully designed screening procedures and have to assume that position, we rarely think about the long chain of events that these procedures were put in place because of. We think about the inconvenience of having to untie our shoes and then tie them back together at the other side. We think about the inconvenience of having to take our phones out of our pockets and be without it for a full 2 minutes while we go through the scanners. But yet somewhere near the beginning of that chain sits this flying boat and 26 dead. A flying boat and 27 people, 4 criminals, 1 survivor, and a crime that was so unprecedented that the world barely possessed the language to describe it. The passenger never intended to become part of aviation history, but history chose them anyway. Their story reminds us that progress is often written in the aftermath of a tragedy. Sometimes the most dangerous gaps are not in the sky, but in the law beneath it. Next time you go through airport security and you think that you're getting frustrated at having to go through this, maybe wear slip-on shoes before you get there, first of all, and socks, because nobody wants to walk around on that floor without socks on your feet, because that's just gross. But maybe take a breath and remember that the only reason that you're being inconvenienced is because other people had to die. But what do you think is the greater failure in this particular story? The security lack that allowed the hijackers aboard, with a legal system that allowed the one surviving hijacker to escape prosecution for his entire life. And of course, if you enjoy stories like this, please make sure you follow the History Happens Facebook page for more deep dives into history's lost and fascinating moments like this, and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Every subscriber helps. You know how I love hearing from you guys. So please leave your comments down below in the comment section on YouTube or on Facebook. And I do read all of those myself. Thank you for watching.